Castle in the Darkness. What a great title for a game. I have to say, I have a bit of a prior relationship with Castle in the Darkness. Yeah, I stumbled upon its demo before it released, and was immediately swept off my feet. As I replayed that demo time and again, I knew in my heart it would go on to greatness. So you might find that while I discuss this game, I have a certain bias towards it. Castle, as described on its own store page, is an action platformer with some RPG elements, much like games from the Castlevania or Metroid series. It is super fast-paced, super hard, and full of secrets. That is a promising description and ticks off many boxes that I like to have ticked. And it's only 6 US greenbacks. I would buy it, and I did. The story here is classic. You're just a guy doing his job. He clocked into work and the whole kingdom got invaded. It's a pretty bad day to show up. Well, the king is missing, or possibly complicit in the dark takeover of his kingdom, and if you want to find out if he is a traitorous scum bag, you're going to have to find all the secrets and piece together what really happened. The start to this game is just great. The music is wonderful, but I'm already starting to see some things I don't like. A few screens in and we already have instant death spikes, and sadly the game will be leaning on those spikes heavily in lieu of actual design or challenges. I guess this is where the super difficulty comes into play. So most boss fights are, I would say, pretty enjoyable and not really unfair, but there are issues with the controls which heavily mar what would otherwise be some fun fights. There's no avoiding it, the controls are wonky. You cannot quickly throw an axe or punch to the left, then redirect to the right quickly. Instead, your input gets kind of gobbled up and you just delay throwing your attack to whatever direction you're facing. What this means is you cannot easily attack backwards and keep moving forward. This reduces options for the player in a way that is not really meaningful, and honestly, it can get quite frustrating. I don't think it was an oversight that it stayed in. Given the design of this game and the games that inspired it, I'm sure Matt Cap, the developer, would be aware that having the ability to quickly throw out a reverse attack would be beneficial to the player, and even open up options for how boss fights could be designed. I don't think it was intentionally left in, I just think it couldn't be fixed due to how the game was built, or he simply just didn't know how to fix it. Or maybe he did leave it in intentionally, I don't know. The thing about exploration is that maps really help, and something else that I have noticed is I can generally map out 3D areas in my head a little bit better than 2D ones. Is that because my brain is computing at such high speeds that it can easily lay out the telemetry of 3D environs? I don't know. I think the truth is that if you don't have some kind of map in your game, then you need to have areas that are distinct. And in the case of a 2D title, you need screens that stand out as anchor points in the player's memory so that you can internally map them out. The problem with Castle is that while areas are generally distinct enough, I don't recall any screens within an area that stood out except for 3 or 4, and all those areas in question had some kind of trap element to them. So the screen itself wasn't really unique, there was just bad memories associated with it. You don't want to do that. The game does have a teleport system later on, which remedies this to a degree, but it's more like it just makes it easier to go back and get lost, if you know what I mean. For me, the areas generally just blurred together. The biggest and best thing that identified an area for me was the music. I don't want to speak poorly of the music, I shan't speak poorly of the music, because it is such a treat. But some tracks have very obvious cuts instead of looping seamlessly. This is most noticeable with boss music, which is odd because depending on your equipment and playstyle, the boss fights can really drag out. I don't think there are many tracks that have this problem. It's just kind of bizarre that the track that does have it is the boss fight music. And I mean, if you're gonna have one track that has a cut in it, I think it should maybe not be the boss music, that's all I'm saying. Speaking of drag, This game's super fast-paced speed takes a hit almost immediately. We enter into a forest where enemies die and they spawn into more enemies. This game feels best when you are quickly dispatching enemies and moving forward, so it feels really bad to kill a zombie and then it explode into maggots, which you then have to dispatch as well. Now, if there are more movement options, or the ability to charge magic independently of your melee strike so you could release magic at any time while still being able to melee, then zombies and other units that dissolve into multiple enemies at their death would feel better killing, since you could just delete them with a magic attack or simply boost jump over them or something along those lines. And if done correct, I think this would add a nice feeling to the game. It would feel good, and it would add a nice rhythm as well. As it stands, once you realize what enemies spawn more enemies on death, it's just kind of this monotonous chore of dispatching them, since it's not a real threat, it's just kind of this weird speed bump. I think Matt was onto something though with the skeletons that explode. The pattern of the bone explosion is normally just a jumbled hitbox that requires you to hang back. Now, if the bones splayed out further and gave the player more margins to dodge within them, then it could add, again, a nice rhythm to mowing down enemies. Especially paired with better movement options. You know, if you had like a quick forward dash or something along those lines, it could really add some spice. Fortunately, the enemies that leave more enemies upon death are quite limited. Unfortunately, the game does suffer from a few design choices that just seems to be inherent to the type of game the developer wanted to make. I strongly suspect that Matt made the game he wanted to make, because I can tell you, while there are parts I adore, there are many more that I don't. You may not realize it, but player and developer have a dialogue that they share while playing a game, and Matt's dialogue with the player goes something like this. I want you to search for secrets, but I'm going to punish you for doing so, for that is something that entertains me. This is my game, not yours. Oh yeah, and while I cited Castlevania as an inspiration for this game, the candles in this game will fuck you up if you hit them, so have fun getting over your knee-jerk reaction to exterminated candles, asshole. Now, if you think that I find this despicable, then you're right, I do. But understand, there are many players that enjoy this kind of thing. When they follow through with what they think is a secret and instead are punished for it, they just laugh. And to a degree, I personally don't mind this, it just depends on how it's done. If it costs me progress, then it's a problem. But more than anything, I find that if you punish a player for sniffing out secrets, then they will eventually stop trying to find them, as it becomes more of a burden than they are worth. And if there's no real reward to them other than getting kicked by the developer, then their drive will be lessened further. Now, I'm not saying I need to be rewarded with better gear necessarily. A secret that is merely a room with a particular motif or theme that helps further tell the story through its environment can suffice. And honestly, those are some of my favorite secrets to find. The only thing better than that would be finding a boss fight that really requires the player to know the mechanics of the game. But the issue here is you should be reinforcing the player for being clever and finding your secret rooms, not punishing them with death. Now, to Matt's credit, save rooms abound, for better or worse, and the particular room that I'm discussing does have a save room very close by. There are other small annoyances that just kind of really add up against the overall experience. These are things that, again, I feel like were just things that Matt intrinsically valued as a game developer, or still values as a game developer, I'm not sure. It's stated that Metroid and Castlevania were sources of inspiration, and while that appears to be true, I think it'd be more accurate to say that a lot of the design decisions were inspired by kaizo trap and precision platforming games. You have spikes that suddenly fall from the ceiling in this game, and in one such case, you cannot even see the spikes are coming, and this is right after a grueling boss fight, so there's a good chance that you'll just die on the spot, and then have to complete that boss fight again. Later on, you have areas where as soon as you enter a room, there will be a spike to your right flank, and from the other side of the room, a projectile will be flying right at your ass as soon as you enter. Now, your normal reaction would be to just run to the right and then hop over the projectile. But if the thigh pad of your armor even so much as grazes a spike, you die instantly. I'm not really cool with that. Falling onto spikes, sure, kill me. Jump onto spikes, sure, end me. But if I'm on the same level as the spikes, I feel like I should be able to walk between them, you know, like in La Mulana. And this is really how the platforming is balanced out. Spikes are everywhere, and your jumping around needs to be, I guess I should say, thoughtful. The movement feels slippery. Not like ice physics, it just doesn't feel as tight as it should. That said, I don't really recall dying because of how the guard moves. There's almost an uncanny valley feeling to it. I can't explain it. Something just feels off about it. Since I cannot actually explain what's going on here, I'm just going to mark this criticism as something unique to me and maybe 3 other people who share some kind of brain damage. It was something ever present while playing, and it compelled me to mention it. So I have. Beware. Where this game really fell apart for me is toward the very end. I found myself increasingly exasperated at all the spikes, and then to top it off, I arrived to this very interesting boss. It's this very lengthy fight. At least the gear I had going into it might have made it suboptimal for me. I will concede that. But at this point in the game, I just can't emphasize enough at how fatigued I was just with the design. I just wanted it to be over so I could judge the game harshly. Your approach to this boss is just a mere 2 screens, which has spikes everywhere, of course, and you have to activate this switch to gain access to the boss's lair. Even though this is an easy task, when you find yourself being bested by the boss over and over again, it becomes a mindless, required chore. I would have much rather the design been these 2 screens lead into a save room, which then lead to a scenic hallway to the boss or something like that. Something atmospheric. The main goal is to reduce the monotony to the player here. Am I saying every boss should have a save room next to it? Of course not. If the boss was more of a pushover, I would have no issue with double or tripling the screens to get to them. Something that I think is often not taken into account is the area the boss resides in. The lead up to a boss should be part of the balancing of the boss fight itself. So if you have an easy lead up to the boss, well then you should have a tough boss. And if the lead up is this painful experience, then maybe reward the player with defeating that area with a boss that's more of a pushover. This wasn't necessarily the case here, but if you plan on having a long fight that is nuanced and has multiple phases, I think really it's just a courtesy to the player at that point to make re-engaging the boss after defeat quick. I sometimes get the feeling that developers are afraid to do this because they know their players will gain muscle memory on the boss fight faster, thus reducing their time to properly learn a fight, thus reducing overall gameplay time. Or maybe I'm a paranoid lunatic. The boss fight itself is mostly fine, but I think there are 2 big issues here. First is actually tied to how the magic system works, or rather how long it takes to charge a magic attack. Sometimes I'd find myself cornered by ghost spam, and I would just have to take hits. Part of this is because I opted to use the axe for this fight, which has a really strange cooldown after you exceed throwing 2 axes. But I think if the charge of the magic was just 0.5 seconds faster, it would solve this issue in particular. Fair enough though, I chose to use the axe, and so that should incur certain advantages and disadvantages. Even so, I feel that the charge system takes too long and could or should be on a different button other than your only attack. The second issue with this fight is the sword rain attack. This attack has no particular pattern that I found. When it happens, I basically knew I was going to get hit. Try to hug the wall. If you're on the right side, a sword can and will be on top of you instantly, and you simply will not have time to dodge it. The left side has a different problem. If a sword spawns high, you have time to run past it, but sometimes the swords will come staggered, and if they do, your little legs will not carry you fast enough to clear it. I eventually settled on just running from left to right and hoping that things would turn out alright. You know, it didn't have to be random. It could have had telegraphed patterns or alternating patterns. Because of this janky sword pattern, you will want to go into the fight with as much HP as possible, which makes the lead up to this fight even more aggravating because now you're forced to clear things carefully and to be safe, which means it's going to take longer to re-engage this already long and protracted fight. Add on top of that that sometimes the ghosts just do whatever the hell they want, and you begin to see how someone might lose patience here. But let us say you don't lose patience. You manage to down the boss. Congratulations. Let's see what the next screen is. Oh, spikes. Cool. Why? It was at this point I could feel Matt's face pressed upon mine saying, "Don't fuck up." My controller was loose in my hand, sweat dripping onto the floor. Well, actually it wasn't that bad. I got the upgrade and went to the next area, relieved. What's this? It's a secret underground area. I wanted my progress saved because I knew something was up. I just didn't realize it would be a fusillade of spikes from above, which I had alluded to this earlier. As you can see, there is this darkness that prevents me from seeing what's going on above. You have to trigger this trap, and then enter into the room. There's a great chance that upon entering this area for the first time, you just fucked. Well, isn't it my own fault for going this here way first? No, it's not, because the alternative is much the same. It's just platforming around instant death spikes. How do you progress past this spike hell? Are you seeing this? Is this a frame-perfect jump? Do I need to hit my second jump at the absolute apex of my first jump? What is going on? 1/3 of my total deaths in this game were to this spike trap. Which, by the way, there are achievements for dying. To me, that's always a red flag and an admission from the developer that they couldn't figure out how to design things meaningfully, so they just cudgeled together a bunch of instant death, trial and error, gameplay hell. That is what we are witnessing right now. I spent almost an entire hour here dying over and over. This jump is impossible. It cannot be done. It can't. Look at that clearance. The velocity of my fall is just too much. There's no way around this. I couldn't beat this game. I couldn't beat Castle in the Darkness. Naturally, I realized I needed to change my armor to one that was lighter so that my jumps would be higher. Heavy armor does weigh you down. It says so in the description when you switch to it for the first time, and you notice it immediately. Your jumps drag down faster and your run speed feels slightly slower. I merely forgot about this until I started looking through my menus, then it clicked. I switched armor and almost immediately made the jump. Let me just say, I actually respect this. I just wish there had been more emphasis on item descriptions being meaningful. I know this kind of thing will be a huge turnoff for some players, but it's important to know that I did not have that much armor to choose from. I think many players will probably have different armor options than the ones I did entering the final stretch of the game. As I said before, I wanted the game to be over, and so I began rushing towards what I perceived to be the end. If I had spent some time backtracking or snooping around more, I may have found better armor options that would have alleviated some painful spots. I beat the game, I just didn't complete it. Speaking of, there are quite a few bugs in this title. Controls aside though, it's nothing really game breaking, it's just feels like one dude made the game and reached a point where he said, fuck it, it's going out. And hey, trust me, I know the feeling, that's how all my videos go. That's not to say there isn't a decent amount of game to be had here. In fact, I bypassed probably half the bosses in the game, and secret bosses as well. There's even a nightmare sequence a la Soten, but I just didn't seek any of that out because, as I've said, and I really can't state this enough, the game just fatigued me with its design. When you're heading towards the what you perceive to be the final boss, it's not the true final boss, but it was for me because I'm not going back and playing this game. You run into the princess and she's saying some shit, and who really cares, right? The problem here is that every time you die, you have to go through this sequence again and again. It's a small thing, it's annoying. It would have been cooler if after you talk to her the first time, when you respawn, she's just crying. That way you don't have to engage in skipping the dialogue. And if you approach her and press up or something, she could, you know, tell you that dialogue again if for some reason you wanted to hear it another time. Or she could just not be there the second time. Whatever works, you know, whatever's easier to put in. There's another approach to a boss in the X dimension or something like that, where you have, it's a neat lead up in that you have these hidden platforms and you see snow landing on them, and that's how you navigate to get to the boss's lair. I don't have a huge issue with that, but the snow platforms are kind of staggered, and there's a visual cue for the first one in the background that is not the snow falling that you can easily hop to, and then after that it's kind of hard to know where the other platforms are because there's no background marker and you're relying on the snow. When I was fighting the boss, I was really dreading going back out because, you know, I was nervous about falling on the spikes, and the fight was already a pretty lengthy one, and but when you leave the room, the spikes are gone, and the platforms, I assume, are gone. I didn't really jump to find them, I just ran across. If that's the case, though, where the platforms are going to be gone anyways after you defeat the boss, I think it would have been better to just have had the invisible platforms evenly spaced out with a visual cue in the background, you know, a white pillar for each one. I think the invisible platform approach is a cool set piece, and it's atmospheric or whatever, but I don't agree with how it was executed. I know it's a really minor thing. I just think it would have been better. That the main thing here is just making it so the player can get back to the fight fast. Spikes, yeah, they're everywhere. Obviously I don't like spikes, at least not in this level of abundance. It's one reason why I don't really like precision platforming titles or kaizo games. It's just I don't agree with them. In moderation, that's okay, but when they're everywhere, it just takes it out for me. Now, of course, if you're wanting to make a kaizo or trap game or precision platformer or whatever the hell the genre is called, by all means, just don't spray them everywhere in a game that is like this. Because it feels like there's a bit of an identity crisis to me with this title, where it kind of wants to be like Castlevania, it kind of wants to be like a Metroidvania, but then there's also these spike elements and this kind of trial and error gameplay that's not really core elements of Castlevania or Metroid or Metroidvania. Now, for me, there's so much that I do love in this game. I do believe that the developer Matt Cap made the game he wanted to make, and I don't really fault him for that. Would I recommend this game? I would recommend this game to a particular type of player. In a lot of ways, this game feels like a light kaizo light-like game. There are plenty of traps, all of which one-shot you, some precision platforming that requires specific timing, but with some room for error. If you're looking for a Metroidvania, this ain't really it. It tenuously could be claimed as a Metroidvania. Certainly there are nods to the genre and Soden in particular throughout the game, but there's not really any movement options outside of a double jump. And my playthrough in particular felt really linear. Perhaps I sequence broke everything and went straight to the end, I don't know. So I mean, I would, by a thread, say this could be a Metroidvania, but I would feel disgust classifying it as such. The great tragedy of this title for me is that if the controls were just a little bit tighter and the movement a little less slippery, I could forgive the level design and the other quirks that I have with the game. It would easily go from a recommendation with some caveats to anyone should give it a go. There's so much that I do love in this game, and I certainly wish Matt and I believe Simon and whoever else might be working on the sequel to this game well. If there was one thing I would change, certainly it would be the issue with attacking backwards that I mentioned earlier. If I were to add gameplay elements, it would have to be more movement options. And of course, my most earnest hope for Castle in the Darkness 2 would be to be the Frog Knight. If you could play as the Frog Knight after you beat the game as the guard, I think that would be stupendous. There's so many cool options I think you could add for the Frog Knight in regards to gameplay elements and movement that it would just be really cool to play as a Frog Knight. Now, obviously, you have to look out for feature creep, so I'll just leave it at that. This elevates the game.